Hi, everyone. Looks like most people are here, so I guess we can start getting underway. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. I'm Selby Nimrod, Assistant Curator at the MIT List Visual Arts Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's conversation with artist Andrew Norman Wilson and film and media studies scholar Dr. Joshua Glick. Titled Fictions, Realism, and the Motion Picture Industry, this virtual program is held in conjunction with Andrew Norman Wilson's exhibition at the List Center, the 23rd in our List Projects exhibition series. Before I formally introduce tonight's interlocutors, Norm and Josh, or I guess informally, I'd like to extend the List Center's sincere thanks to those whose support and diligent efforts were instrumental to realizing Norm's exhibition and this public program. We are grateful for the continued institutional support of MIT, the List Center Advisory Committee, and to members of the List Center's Director Circle, whose membership funds our exhibition program. I'd also like to thank the National Endowment for the Arts for their support of our List Project exhibition series, as well as my colleagues at the List Center. The entire team works diligently to facilitate, make public, and sustain our exhibitions and programs. And for tonight's event in particular, I'd like to offer a special thanks to Senior Manager of Campus and Public Programs, Emily Garner, and Program Assistant Elizabeth Ponce, as well as our communications team at Jameson Johnson and Kelly Chen. I'd also like to thank Nick Carbone and MIT AV for the technical support on this event, and all of our virtual programming, though we're doing a little bit less of it these days, as we're really thrilled to be fully reopened. I'd like to thank Kimberly Shea, who is live captioning this event. And of course, Dr. Joshua Glick for his really great, fantastic insights into Norm's work and his enthusiasm for working with Norm to structure what, having had a sneak peek at his questions and presentation, I know will be a really stimulating conversation. And of course, my thanks to Andrew Norman Wilson, with whom it has been my great pleasure to work with on his List Center exhibition. Norm's show at the List is on view in our Bacalar Gallery until January 9th of 2022. And for those of you who are Zooming in from the region, I urge you to visit our now fully reopened galleries, where you can view Norm's exhibitions, as well as solos with Leslie Thornton and Rit Premnath. So I am going to do just some kind of bio reading to introduce our two speakers tonight, and then hand over the floor because they have a really great program prepared. Joshua Glick is the Isabel Peregrine Assistant Professor of English, Film, and Media Studies at Hendrix College and a fellow at the Open Documentary Lab at MIT. He's the author of Los Angeles Documentary and the Production of Public History, and is currently writing a new book that examines the contemporary investment in documentary on both the left and right of the political spectrum. In collaboration with Patricia Aufderheide, he is co-editing the Oxford Handbook of Documentary. Dr. Glick also works actively in the public humanities, and he is co-curating an exhibition at the Museum of Moving Image in New York that opens this December and explores both malicious forms of moving image manipulation and the civic uses of emerging media. Andrew Norman Wilson is an artist whose films and video installations draw on a range of filmic conventions to examine intersecting histories of cinema, image circulation, and labor. The corporate and political interests that undergird the so-called creative economy are a persistent theme for Wilson, and his works have taken a critical eye to Google, Disney, and Eastman Kodak to consider how Silicon Valley, the entertainment industry, and the art world manufacture cultural products from contracted labor. Norm's work has been shown in recent solo exhibitions at Ordette in Milan, as well as Kunstverein Braunschweig. He has recently shown in group exhibitions at Sculpture Center in New York, the Luma Foundation in Arles, and the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York as well, of course. Norm's work is in the collections of the Museum of Modern Art, New York, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and the Stolben Collection, among many others. And his List Center exhibition is the first institutional solo in the United States. Welcome, Norm and Josh. I know everyone is really excited to hear from you two, so I'm going to hand things over to Josh now. But first, want to just say that there will be time for a brief Q&A at the end of the program. And to submit questions, you may do so anytime by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Okay, Josh, please begin.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you to Selby for the kind introduction, and to Emily and Nick and Kimberly as well for the tech wizardry, for this evening, and making sure everything runs smoothly. It's really an honor to be collaborating with the MIT LIST Visual Arts Center, and for the opportunity to be in dialogue with Norm today. There's just sort of three things that I'd like to say about Norm's art to help, I think, frame the conversation for the late afternoon, evening. It's that sort of transitional hour. First, that projects such as Impersonator and Kodak, two works currently installed at the list, constitute, I would say, poignant reflections on the dynamics of media change, both in terms of technological change, as well as shifts in habits, rituals, practices, even things like trends or fads. Second, that Norm's work really attends to the social consequences of what often gets championed as innovation or progress in the media industries. And third, Norm's installations encourage us to explore what and where really constitutes resistance within our current media landscape. And so with that, we'll proceed with a kind of Q&A style dialogue. I'll have some questions about Impersonator and Kodak that I'm hoping will open up some avenues of inquiry. For particular questions, I'll offer some context to help sketch the stakes of the project and situate Norm's work within a broader field of cultural production. So first is just a couple sort of general questions, provocations, and I'm going to be sort of sharing my screen, so sort of elegantly trying to shift between this sort of collective box that we're in, and then a sort of PowerPoint, and then at times showing clips. So it's going to be kind of interactive, but perhaps with those quick moments of transition that come with this kind of thing. So first, just to sort of show two kind of initial stepping off images, one from each. Or I should say two from each of these projects. I'm just going to share my screen real quick. Hold on. Great. So we have two images from Impersonator right here, and then two from Kodak, just to sort of remind people. I know a lot of folks are familiar with these projects, having watched them or having visited the show. But just to sort of remind us of where we're at with these projects. And also, I mean, to sort of move on from here to think about, this notion of creative labor that I think figures very prominently in sort of both of these projects, how it's done, who does it, so what happens to creative labor over time in the sort of media industries. And I think part of what happens in each of these projects is so important because it sort of sits within this sort of resistant relationship to how sort of creative labor in tech and in Hollywood is often imagined, right? It's often romanticized, it's presented as this sort of exciting thing, or it's often hidden and effaced. And so just a couple of slides right now that I think sort of speak to the kind of common sort of cultural imaginary of what it is to sort of work in tech or perhaps in Hollywood. In recent years, in the long 2010s. So we have, the internship, which is sort of Google as a liberal arts college campus, certainly. We have, projects like The Social Network and other origin stories of troubled sort of male genius. This sort of, extends to the biopics on Steve Jobs, where we see sort of charismatic singular figures and founders sort of creating, wonderful products within the tech industry or the entertainment industry, Silicon Valley, of course, and then sort of some recent projects more from the kind of film and television world, shifting from nostalgia to something that's just sort of pure romance, the stuff of pure fantasy. And of course, there is a kind of say, counter tradition or sort of more experimental tradition that I would sort of encourage maybe folks to understand Norm's work sort of within, things like Life and Death of 9413, a Hollywood Extra, a sort of early look at creative labor in Hollywood and Los Angeles that's sort of anything but kind of romantic. So this is all a kind of lead up to perhaps a kind of question for Norm, having sort of sketched this kind of cultural imaginary of what it is to work in tech, what it is to work in Hollywood, the projects that we're sort of thinking about this evening, both Impersonator and Kodak, present a kind of different view. And sort of my question is, what can we sort of learn about the sort of business as usual or sort of state of being for the media industries by looking at, marginal forms of labor, labor that is often invisible, just to sort of, mainstream society. And sort of by looking at these figures, I mean, what is to be perhaps illuminated, or what are you sort of exploring by way of looking at these marginal or contingent or precarious sort of figures in the tech and media industries?
I guess that having worked in these industries and having grown up with a father who worked for Kodak, I see these companies differently than how they're normally represented. And though my work has changed a lot since I started making art about a decade ago, it has always dealt with gaps. Like I would call myself a sort of gapsploitation director. And it's the gap between the way things are and the way things are represented that the art is found. And so, yeah, it's sort of a simple answer, though I think they'll become more complex as this conversation goes on. It's really just more adequately representing the whole field of labor within these entities, sort of from within.
Yeah, I mean, I really like that. I mean, it's sort of gapsploitation, this sort of fissures, cracks, spaces sort of within these industries. And it's also, I mean, it's making what is often, again, to just sort of mainstream society, the sort of image of these industries that they project to the world. It's sort of making a lot of, this labor that is often invisible, visible. So there's there is, I think, that sort of strong, dimension to your products or to your projects for sure. I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about, I suppose, your process for? I mean, it sounds like a lot of these projects emerge from sort of your work, in these industries or in a kind of resistant relationship to them. But I mean, how do they develop? And if you could maybe share a little bit about your sort of process of creation, or even maybe things like research as you sort of move across so many different forms of media in these projects.
Yeah, both of the projects of the videos that are within the exhibition were quite different in their formation, and they look different, and the material that they're composed of, just on a very immediate level, the images and the sounds come from very different places. So I'll start with Kodak. Kodak hired my father straight out of college in 1976 to work in their film processing labs. And what's interesting about that year is that it's the same year that a Kodak employee had invented the first digital camera. And so 35 years later, Kodak went bankrupt and, today operates at a fraction of its former scale. My father left the company 4 years before that bankruptcy. And so ever since I had made this project called Workers Leaving the Googleplex that emerged out of the time that I spent working for Google, it seemed kind of obvious that I should make something about my father's career at Kodak, and specifically this kind of unraveling of the company in relation to how they handled the digital revolution, let's call it, right? Or the emergence of digital technologies and digital imaging. So it started with me interviewing my father for hours, and a really interesting detail that I initially hung on to from those interviews was that over the course of his 33-year career with the company, he worked amongst blind people who were hired to handle film in the dark due to their heightened tactile sense. And so Rich, the protagonist of this video, is a hybrid of my father and an imagined character who worked in film processing at Kodak until a workplace accident left him blind. This character then started working in the dark, packaging film with other blind Kodak employees until they were laid off as the company lurched towards bankruptcy. And so the story is told through Rich's point of view, like the viewer literally sees what this blind person sees in their mind's eye as they listen to these tape recordings of the memoirs of George Eastman, Kodak's founder. And Rich is trying to focus on the company history to become a successful entrepreneur himself. So you see images of Kodak technologies and patent diagrams and workplace photography, but he's haunted by the fallout from Kodak's collapse, right? He's divorced, he's estranged from his children, he's living on welfare, and he's suffering from some kind of mental illness. So we also see his personal history, which he'd rather forget because it's holding him back in life. And so this structure allowed me to incorporate a bunch of imagery that was shot on Kodak film and Kodak videotape from my family archives, right? My family's basically cast in the roles of this fictional character's family, but also imagery from Kodak's archives, things my father had access to, but also things that I found in the Kodak archives at the University of Rochester and the George East Museum. And because you, the viewer, are seeing what this former Kodak employee sees in their mind, the imagery is allowed to unfold in a way that's loose and nonlinear and at times free associative. And so in the end, I realized, or like at a certain point, I realized that the character is in a way based on my process of making the work, right? Like the script was mostly written in the Pasadena Public Library with me sitting at a desk, sorting through all this archival material I digitized and trying to make some kind of sense out of it. So it was like a form of method writing and method directing in a way. So that's Kodak. As for the newer work, Impersonator, I've spent a lot of time in Los Angeles without a place to live, sort of like nomadically bouncing between there and other places where I am doing things as an artist. And while I haven't gone as far as living in a tent, I've always paid a lot of attention to the people who do live on the streets. And I run 20 to 30 miles per week. And so I'm on foot through different areas a lot more than the average Angelino. And so this project gave me this motivation to just stop and talk to people who live on the street. And I got to know one guy pretty well who lives on the LA River, right where the river scene in Impersonator takes place. And he's a really good engineer. Like he fixes bikes and sells bikes to other people who live on the river. And from the beginning, I wanted the character of Impersonator to be a really skilled DIY engineer. So I think I was drawn to this man because of that. And, it turns out that our tent poles broke on the day that we were shooting there. So I bought some spares off of him. And then there's also a lot that happens on Hollywood Boulevard. And so I spent a lot of time talking to actual impersonators on the boulevard. The weirdest one being this guy, Dante Valentine, who dresses as a stormtrooper. And he has what he calls a school of attraction called Rockstar Casanova, which is basically like a life coaching program for people who want to become pickup artists. And he's also a musician and basically like plays hair metal and then does live event promotion as well. And so most people I met both on the boulevard and the river are these kind of go-getters, like hustlers even. And they have to be because of the conditions of their lives. And then on the other side, I had to represent cops and their behavior. So I just went to a bunch of police stations and asked them what they would do in certain situations, like asking them to describe hypothetical scenarios. And so it's fascinating, this talk, I think realism is in the title. And while I did read things to prepare myself for this project, there's only so much I could glean from like books and articles. And this is a big part of why I'm so interested in making movies now. It's because to construct cinematic realism, you kind of have to go out and just find it. And in that way, I felt much more like a part of, like, quote, society than when I was making Kodak or my recent Phil Collins video, because I talked to probably 20 cops during pre-production and had to hire cops to stand around on set and make sure that my fake cops weren't acting like real cops and trying to frisk people or pull them over in the LAPD truck we rented. And now I have all these cops' phone numbers, you know? So yeah, very different ways of working, but similar character formations in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's a kind of, I mean, almost a kind of ethnography, or, I mean, it's definitely, it's, you know, you go to the location, you're doing multiple forms of research, you're sort of inhabiting in various ways aspects of the project as you're creating. I mean, I mean, you bring up a number of interesting points, some about Kodak, which we'll get to in a little bit, but for Impersonator, and I'll just sort of set the scene here, you mentioned a number of locations, images, and I'll just briefly share my screen to just sort of show some images from that film, and then also show a brief clip to sort of set the scene for that environment. So let me just go back here. Oops, you did mention workers leaving the Googleplex. I wanted to give that a brief shout out, one of your earlier projects, but another really sort of fascinating project sort of dealing with labor, Google, and a sort of homage in some ways, a kind of winking at the early, one of the first projected motion picture films, Workers Leaving the Factory from 1895. But for Impersonator, going into our contemporary moment, right, we sort of follow around this figure through this third person perspective. And they're all around the city. They're on Hollywood Boulevard, by the river. They're sort of on sidewalks and streets and stoops and valleys and sort of everywhere. You know, very rarely do they take off their mask. But we are sort of following them around as they have this kind of Bluetooth, you know, piped in sort of talk radio show, Access Hollywood, that they're listening to. And they're sort of wandering around the city, but also sort of hearing about a string of murders, or, you know, rumored to be murders that have been happening. And this person seems like a kind of a disgruntled figure, sort of doubly marginalized. As you mentioned, you know, part of the unhoused sort of demographic of the city, one of the over 63,000 individuals currently unhoused in Los Angeles, but also sort of marginalized within the media industry, sort of struggling to kind of find a place as an impersonator, finding steady work. We get the sense that they're just sort of struggling to, not just to make ends meet, but to just sort of, I mean, have, you know, some kind of place in the city. And I just want to show a brief clip to sort of set the scene for this film. And then we'll sort of revisit some more images and then a more pointed question or two. So let's just go right here. Great.
All right, let's do this. What's happening? How's your day? How are you? Where are you? Are you alone? Are you on your way home from work? Are you happy to hear the sound of my voice? I, for one, am especially happy that you, my friends, are listening today, because I was able to land a guest of mythic proportions. But before I get ahead of myself, I must say that this is Access Hollywood, your independent investigation of the points at which the entertainment industry meets intelligence services, the security state, the military, finance, organized crime, and even pedophile rings. In the 2002 film, It's a Very Merry Muppet Christmas.
Okay. We have a brief clip of what he's doing in the film. And to go back here to some more images, I mean, this is the sort of the tone and tempo, right? As they're sort of wandering around and arguably becoming sort of almost influenced by this Access Hollywood sort of talk radio segment, becoming maybe paranoid, sort of, avoiding things as much as they're sort of searching for things. And I'm curious, I mean, the exact kind of costuming, the exact sort of characterization we see here, I mean, it's a figure that, as I've mentioned, is sort of marginalized both within the city as well as trying to find a place or steady work in, say, the media industries as an impersonator, but also a kind of maybe composite character. We've seen sort of elements of this outfit in video games, in film, in television. See him right here, sort of dejected outside Wiener Schnitzel location. Just saw the clip. And I was curious, I mean, as I was sort of mining some of my own memories of like costuming and character, I mean, it made me think of, Return of the Jedi, it made me think of the Predator costume. I know we see the Predator outfit and sort of figurine at one point, RoboCop, Cyrax from Mortal Kombat 3, the Halo figure, a kind of every person, right, of pop culture sort of, it sort of amalgamates into this, impersonator character. And so, I mean, in addition to that, there's a kind of sort of militia element, the sort of donning of this sort of riot gear, of this sort of combat gear. It made me think of some of the recent images, that we've seen with, say, the January 6th rioters. So I'm curious, I know you had mentioned, some of the sort of inspiration for the character came out of sort of your interactions with doing this project, with meeting people, with being on location. But I'm curious, just sort of thinking through that, like the outfitting and sort of the multiple sort of points of reference perhaps for this character. And if that lends some insight maybe into their sort of marginalization or who they're aspiring to be or trying to be. I just sort of set up, there's sort of on one whole, there's, this kind of pop culture sort of stew of figures, but then on the other, there's this sort of maybe more extremist sort of kind of mode of living out a kind of dark fantasy of some kind. So I'm curious to see your sort of thoughts on that.
Yeah, the January 6th stuff is spot on. Like a lot of the pieces that went into the costume that Chadwick Rantanen and I made came from looking at what people were wearing when they stormed the Capitol on January 6th, like paintball gear, motocross gear, just like tactical survivalist gear. And so it's kind of a composite. The costume itself is a composite of armor from all of these different fields coming together and then painted to look seamless to become a character that, in the scene before the one that you had showed, the Thor impersonator refers to impersonator's costume as a stormtrooper, Halo foot soldier kind of thing. And later on, the podcast host refers to non-player characters when the impersonators listen to the podcast again. And so while impersonator wants to be an individual and be seen as skillful and be respected, they kind of can't escape these references to these like almost like troopers or drones with limited agency, right? But we were very careful about trying to position the podcast so that you couldn't tell whether it was left wing or right wing, and therefore couldn't tell like where impersonator might be situated. And the podcast situating them, I would say, came from watching Lucretia Martel's films, in particular Zama. It was really important to see how she would focus on Zama, the protagonist. You would see his face, you see his face in the film while conversations play out off screen. And it produces this effect where the conversations seem to be Zama's interior dialogue. And so in the case of impersonator, you're hearing the podcast that they're listening to while looking at them. And so it becomes a representation of their inner space, which is emphasized, as you said, even further when the podcast motivates their actions. But I would say that like this idea of rendering the character totally anonymous and you never seeing anything about their identity, you know, they're not even gendered, came from just like watching all of Robert Bresson's films, and how, like in a film like Pickpocket, the protagonist has this excess of hand motor skills that they use to make and maintain, to make a living, really. And in the case of Impersonator, used to make and maintain their suit. And as it will become more explicit in the future, commit crimes. There's this way in which Bresson handles actors where they aren't really actors, they're more like models. And Gauzier Eugenie, who played Impersonator, doesn't have acting experience, but I like the way he moves. We're friends. And so I wanted him to just move in this suit, and instead of expressing emotions with his face, with their face, the protagonist becomes a kind of like avatar that the audience can internalize the emotions of. And because of this condition of a masked character that doesn't express emotions, I started thinking of third-person shooter video games where you see the protagonist's body, you know, from behind, and you imagine yourself in their place. And I think this partial collapse of the viewer's experience into Impersonator's experience can highlight, or hopefully highlights, Impersonator's dissociation from reality over the course of the short. It's as if Impersonator is viewing the reality in front of them as a film, like the viewer, or as a game, and the costume and podcast they listen to exacerbates that delusion.
Yeah, and it's very interesting what you said about just sort of the ability, or the inability, I should say, to read the characters sort of politically or ideologically. Like, you're sort of looking for these sort of moments or cues. Like, is this figure about to be like radicalized in some direction? Are they going to sort of take action in a way, that will, sort of provide a kind of lens through which we can sort of understand them, and even that podcast as well. I think we're gonna come back and sort of loop back around to sort of questions of politics and agency and resistance. I was curious, to add some more, some references, things that the sort of film is making us think about, and sort of directions in pop culture that it's moving in. Disney seems to be everywhere, in this short film. And just to sort of give some weight to that, we have the kind of Thor reference, we have the sort of Predator character reference on Hollywood, this particular part of Hollywood Boulevard that we see in the sort of bottom center image. I mean, it's sort of tricked out with Disney stores and Disney owned facilities. We have the sort of Disney animation studio right here that the character sort of encounters. And then, from the Muppets to the MCU is a kind of point of reference. The podcast person sort of talks about Muppets and the relationship to conspiracy theories, particularly for 9/11, and then Captain America as being a shared symbol, or not being a shared symbol, is also the point of sort of contention in the film. And I'm sort of wondering the ways in which Disney kind of haunts this town, this film, this character, in the sense we almost like can't get outside of Disney. I mean, in some, to some extent, there's good reason for that, right? Transmedia Disney. I mean, it's been a company, a corporation, an entity that is sort of thought it's of itself really across media since the early 20th century, and especially since the post-World War II period, in TV, in parks, in town planning, and cartoons, and theatrical film. It's sought to have a large footprint, and it's gotten even larger. Recently, a fun little map of the recent Disney shenanigans in terms of its acquisitions and its mergers. It wants to be the sort of center of a kind of global sort of content producing empire. And these are just some of its assets and entities right here. The 20th Century Fox catalog and facilities was crucial for that. And then, of course, the shift into Disney Plus, and we can see its sort of collection of talent and properties right here. it's also a company that likes to showcase its own labor and Imagineering in very sort of romantic ways, right? One Day at Disney is a film that, or a series, I should say, really about the labor force of Disney. And I sort of, bring this up again as a way of sort of maybe asking a question and just sort of interested to know some of your thoughts about just the presence of Disney and maybe is it, in part something that the film is saying that, this character, they move to many different locations in the city across Los Angeles, but, just as they cannot get, sort of beyond Disney within the sort of, broadcast waves that are coming in through the helmet or physical things that they encounter, perhaps we, as just, consumers of media, as people that are engaging with media each and every day, cannot get beyond Disney. I mean, I was just curious if that's maybe a kind of critical point of the project.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of amazing. Like I made it halfway through the project of like writing the script and doing pre-production without, let's say, thinking that Disney was going to be present in every frame. And then I realized that it sort of was. I was like, oh, right. Like the Hensons sold the Muppets to Disney. Oh, right. Like Disney absorbed 20th Century Fox. And so now they own Predator. And so then it was like, okay, well, I'll make the opening scene have a Thor impersonator, because that's Marvel. And yeah, they'll walk by the Disney Animation Studios building. And so it became like everything was planned basically halfway. And in a lot of cases, I just had to plan to turn the camera 45 degrees to catch some kind of like Disney IP. The Predator being a good example of that, being like, okay, Gozi, just walk, by the Predator statue. And I don't know, it's a shitty brand. And it's one more thing that I think is contributing to like societal rot. And I think deep down, basically everyone knows it. And, I'm sorry, but if you're like a grown up and you orient your social calendar around Marvel releases, like I think you're an adult baby. And I don't know, Josh probably has more sophisticated takes on like the entity that is Disney, but I think this word haunting is apt in that in the opening scene, Impersonator is sort of like, or at least the Thor impersonator tries to persuade Impersonator to drop this anonymous DIY costume and assume a character like Darth Vader, right? Because that's what everyone knows. And so I think it's this thing that culturally creates a certain reality that prevents other realities from being realized.
Yeah, no, I mean, I appreciate your thoughts or insights, and, reflections, because I think it was, I mean, it's present in the film, but often, it's not sort of centered in the way that like, I don't know, product placement, would sort of encourage us to think, right? It's a wink, it's something from the side, it's a reference. It's sort of as if Disney is like, yeah, something, a kind of spectral entity, that is sort of haunting the film and this character. And we're going to move on to some other questions, but yes, I mean, I think, in coming months, I think Disney, I mean, it will continue to be, and in coming years, one of the sort of central, content producing entities as, within the streaming wars, sort of Netflix occupies kind of one, central node on the landscape. I mean, Disney's certainly another, and then with, the Discovery, Warner Media, sort of nexus under the sort of tent of AT&T, that's going to be another force to contend with. And, they all sort of look to Los Angeles, still as the sort of, sort of field to kind of cultivate the brand. So I think, yeah, it was spot on. And again, maybe we can sort of come back around to this with a question or two about resistance. But for Kodak, you elegantly really described the sort of nested histories that this project involves, right? And just again to briefly share the screen. Nested histories, and by that I mean there's a kind of archival engagement with Kodak's fascinating history. It sort of emerges in these sort of apparitional images, the mind's eye, as you said, from this blind character Rich, and we sort of see these sort of maps and diagrams and photographs from Kodak's history. We also see some images of you, Norm. I think that's you for some of these home movies.
Me on the left, and then my brother on the right.
Oh, okay, there we go. Yeah, this sort of transitional image here on the right to sort of show these characters are blending in, the sort of shifts of memory. And I was struck. These are some, well, maybe we'll get to this one in a second, but the kind of work of sort of private memory and it sort of shifts into public history, and even, just sort of thinking about what can be sort of understood about Kodak, about its history, about the sort of processes of change and technology through going through this sort of hyper personal route in some ways. I know there's probably a lot of sort of perhaps personal things you sort of learned perhaps, or it's a kind of turning the artistic process sort of inward to an extreme degree. But I'm curious just sort of what sort of things that you were hoping to engage with or to get at, taking this sort of most intimate and personal of routes towards something much broader in a kind of public sense. And I realize I'll just maybe share a very brief clip, just a couple seconds of the project, just to sort of familiarize people with the sort of tempo and the sound and the look of this really fabulous film. So I'll just share my screen real quick.
You take 1/10 of a second of an idea, and suddenly it's 10 years later. Kodak.
Yes.
Kodak. Exactly.
Exactly.
A trademark should mean nothing. Carry no dictionary definition. Associate only with the product that comes instantly to mind. Like that. Of course, I didn't invent photography. I invented popular photography.
Yes.
I created a new...
Right. And the film, Rich is the character, but Rich is, I think, a really great word just to describe the kind of breadth of media, that we get in this project, and we move across photographs and moving images and the sort of voiceover. So I guess I'm curious just to center us back on that question, sort of private memory into public history, or even just sort of the work of fiction and fabrication in sort of doing the work of history and historiography.
Yeah, on a pragmatic level, like the structure allowed me to walk through Kodak's history. Although the question of documentary truth, which at this point for me is just second nature, like that question, is raised because Rich is clearly an unreliable narrator. I also think there was something to the work where, like, Kodak presaged social media in this way, in which it like successfully commodified our personal experience, right? And obviously the operation was different, and there was like a longer time span when you take a photograph, send it away, and get it back. But it's kind of a precursor to Facebook and Instagram in a way. But I think a lot of like what happens over the course of the video in terms of like seeing media change, right? Because at the beginning you see a lot of silver gelatin prints, and by the end you're looking at CGI, it gets a little bit abstract here because we're dealing with rather complicated form of abstraction when it comes to CGI. But I had this idea about photography and its analog contingency, right? Like you take a picture at a certain time in a certain place and you're left with a certain image. Whereas now we have this wholly constructed digital realism, which has emerged because of computer generated images, where a lot of the advertisements that we look at today like seem like they're real, but they're actually not, you know, or like even like I have these friends that model jewelry and female condoms. And I think it's actually the female condoms that they've like been able to trick Amazon's algorithms that try and detect computer generated images. And so they're able to like upload these CGI images as if they were photographs, which is what you have to upload to Amazon for product photography. But yeah, I think if during the 20th century, we could hold some belief that a photograph is representative of a particular view in time, then digital post-production and computer generated imagery have eradicated that potential. Now we can see whatever we want to see or whatever someone else wants us to see, regardless of whether or not what is represented ever existed. And this goes for edited photographs as well as CGI. So images start to rely heavily on things like morality and memory. And so what Rich, this character, is experiencing is analogous to how I think we experience images today. And that is like when images internal to one's psyche appear or surface on the retina and are projected back inwards before making contact with the world, they generate something like looping pulses that turn the mind into like a continuously repeating mental prison. And so that's the work's reflection of media change in my mind, right? Like we just can't trust images at all. And I don't think we ever could, but in the 20th century, we certainly had an idea that we could. And so the structure of the work allowed me to just kind of walk through this development. And in the end, you're left with this blind character who's just imagining these images that are based on things in the real world, but they have no indexical relationship to it.
Yeah, I mean it's an intense. You know, I don't want to ruin the ending of the film for folks that haven't seen it, but I mean it is. I mean, this intense journey. I mean that we experience. I mean through, as I described, these sort of nested histories. I mean there's the sort of big histories of these sort of changes in media, and then also, I mean, for labor forces, you know, and sort of folks kind of working in these industries and what it means to be displaced or to have a certain kind of marginalized status or a great one within a particular, line of work. I mean, before maybe taking a couple questions, I do want to ask you about this sort of question of resistance, critique, you know, opposition, where it exists. Can it exist? And you know, I mean, on the one hand, there's a sort of, sense that the lights kind of go out on each of these characters in their films. I mean, there's this, you know, a kind of collapse, for the impersonator, and I'll just sort of share my screen real quick. Hold on, sorry. In Impersonator, right, the character gets to the police station and just essentially collapses onto the ground. We're not exactly sure what's going to happen after this sort of very harrowing experience, going around in the city. In Kodak, we get the sense of, you know, the destruction or the sort of implosion of a number of the buildings, you know, in Kodak Park. That happened. I mean, the company went bankrupt in 2011, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The character Rich experiences a kind of really intense, we aren't exactly sure what's happening, but a kind of psychotic episode or some sort of crisis, which is quite harrowing for him. And so, that sort of, on the one hand leads me to sort of a question of, what's to be done. I mean, in terms of, a kind of resistant stance that these characters could take, or perhaps, others, beyond these films, certainly, against these larger institutions and forces of media that you're describing. We get sort of glimpses of agency in the film. I mean, this is a sort of moment where each character is sort of looking at their hands and to sort of think of, what is to be done, what's to become of them as individuals, and perhaps can they take a kind of oppositional stance. We see, the sort of Arthur meme. Shout out to Selby for sort of identifying this in her great essay. The sort of fist that sort of the impersonator, the hand sort of falls into a fist at this crucial moment. We aren't exactly sure what's going to come next. Also made me think of, the Kinofist from Eisenstein, and thinking about the sort of rhetorical power, rhetorical work of a lot of sort of his films, thinking about the sort of labor power of his movies and the kind of oppositional kind of class stance that the films could strike, and sort of the work of cinema to really sort of take a kind of political stance. We could think of resistance today in sort of maybe the most pragmatic of forms in terms of labor, right? We see the symbol of the fist right here, International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees. Very recently, I think it was ratified maybe a day or two ago, the agreement that they reached, but sort of workers fighting for, more rights, wages, things related to lifestyle within the media industries. This is sort of one area of resistance. Perhaps it's in terms of these sorts of, say, social documentaries that are coming out, taking a kind of critical stance on elements of the media industries, but coming from so thoroughly inside these institutions. We can see Hulu on the right, and this is a Netflix film on the left. Perhaps the films of, say, Harun Farokhi, as well, coming from, say, the art world. So I'm just sort of curious, right? I mean, as to sort of where you see kind of resistance or critique, and perhaps even the role of the artist in this moment.
Yeah. It's difficult. Like, I wouldn't want to prescribe a role for artists in any way. And I think that my work has progressively become less and less explicitly political over the years. But there's something that's happening in Impersonator, and that I think will extend into the future and become more explicit, where this alienated figure within the third act discovers that things like friendship and love beyond the limits of the couple and getting to know one's neighbors, these really childish sounding things, might be some kind of antidote to their predicament. Just like relating to people in space in a very basic way, because this character is so bound up and hidden and kind of isolated. And similar to what I was saying about Rich and his relationship to images and Kodak, they also have these voices, playing in their head. And so even for me as an individual, trying to move beyond that kind of relationship to the world, or maybe one could call it like lack of relationship to the world, I think is a starting point. Just public education outside of institutions as well. I think that's my interest in this podcast, and it being on this kind of like edge of things. politically, but I don't really have a great answer. I mean, do you?
I think part of the answers. I mean, it's in the work, and I mean it's something. I realize it's a huge question. It's, maybe even a sort of crazy question to ask you to speak. In terms of the role of artists, and taking a kind of political stance, in this moment or where resistance lies. I mean, I think a lot of the great stuff we're seeing in each of these projects, as well as say workers leaving the Googleplex, has to do with the sort of laying bare, I mean, the sort of making visible of structures of processes that are often invisible or marginalized or unknown, and sort of advancing a kind of critique from the inside that works by way of, I don't know, satire, hyperbole, grotesque, caricature. I mean, I think in some ways comedy becomes, and the sort of comedic art sort of finds its way into your work with a real sort of razor's edge. And I don't know if that's intention or whatever, but that's, I think, part of the kind of arsenal here. As far, I mean, so I think that's sort of just speaking from your work and sort of what you were saying. I know we're running out of time, but the kind of sort of relational dimension to sort of being with people in the world, is having a kind of politics, politics of everyday living, of, thinking about what it means to be a neighbor, what it means to sort of live as part of a neighborhood. And I think, the work of great art, and I think, yours is really part of it. I mean, models sort of new forms of social relation, and relationships, sort of ways of thinking about being together. And also just, I would say, like the freshness, the sort of fresh quality of your images. I'm thinking about a kind of a Herzog quote, I think, from like Werner Herzog, eats his shoes. I mean, decades old film, but a moment where he's just sort of claims like the need for new images, fresh images. Like we just need like a new vocabulary of images, and if that comes from nonfiction or fiction or theater or whatever, but that there's just a real, starving for fresh images to help us sort of see the world anew. And I think that's also important. I mean, I see in the chat there's a juicy question about NFTs and deepfakes. I'll just say in my like one minute take on that, and then Norm might have a thought as well. And especially for deepfakes, I mean, I think accentuated a lot of the anxieties and things we see in Norm in some of your projects about the inability to understand or to decipher the relationship between sort of fiction and reality, truth and false. Deepfakes have, and a lot of synthetic media, I think, has sort of amplified, those sorts of fears, for sure, especially in the realm of, revenge porn and these areas where deepfakes are unfortunately, thriving. But I think, synthetic media can also be used, for the civic good in all kinds of ways, for critique, for satire, for imagining sort of civic and social purposes. There's no reason why a lot of that same technology of using, AI-enabled media that's used for deepfakes can't be used for other things as well. And in art installations and museums and amateur work, I think it's really making some good inroads. That was my take on deepfakes. I don't know if, Norm, if you have any thoughts on NFTs or deepfakes, but I know we're 1 minute over at this point. So.
Oh, wow. What do you think, Selby? What's going on?
I mean, I'm really curious to hear your takes, Norm, and then I think maybe we'll have to sort of wrap it up. One, I don't know if I can share like my 2 cents here, but there were a couple of things that, I was thinking. We're talking about how like images aren't trustworthy, and of course they're not, and like that illusion, I think for everyone has been totally ripped away. Like I don't think that's like a conversation that's only being had because of deepfakes, and like that's not a conversation that's only being had within like a certain kind of like academic or intellectual like space. Now it's being had like on the news and all of this stuff, and I just think like there's a way in which it's like, well, if none of that's trustworthy, you might as well make fiction. And that kind of draws an interesting line in your practice. Like if the realism of images is not real, then, just go ahead and give itself over to its like utter construction.
Yeah, I think it's prompted this sort of flurry of comments now in the Q&A and comment section. This is good. And yeah,
I know.
I mean, for Norm, I think that's a great. I mean, the idea of sort of fiction, sort of doing the work of, you know, understanding the past, you know, and of history, I think is one of the things I definitely took away from your projects.
Mhm. Regarding the question about the use of Cisco's magnum opus #1, yeah, it's, you know, on Cisco phone systems, which a lot of corporations use. When you call up, you'll hear this particular track, and that's the track that I used over the credits of Impersonator. And there's something about, let's say, like the mutability of that track, you know, where you can hear it when you call Delta, you could hear it when you call Costco, you could hear it when you call some kind of healthcare corporation, that like resonated with Impersonator's anonymity, and maybe they're kind of like their betweenness, you know, like you illustrated all these examples of different characters in armor. Maybe it's adaptability between contexts that I liked, but it also just carried this kind of like this mood that seemed to be appropriate after collapse.
Yeah, I think the soundtracks in your films were fascinating. I mean, there's something sort of sinister, provocative. I mean, whether it's a sort of musical hum or voices, I think there was a really sort of strong kind of sonic dimension. I mean, just throughout, you know, both projects. I'm happy to keep. I mean, Selby, it's up to you. I mean, I see some people asking some questions. I'm happy to just keep the flow going. We can do a stop. Open to.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like seeing so many questions roll in, and they're rolling in different places. I don't know if y'all are looking at the Q&A box, but maybe we can take one final question from Anthony DeSenza, who says, I'm wondering if there are any thoughts by either Norm or Josh on a possible weakening of the collective imagination, and then in parens, which is a space of political possibility, by the sophistication of our imaging engines, that the imagination itself is effectively colonized by representations of mass spectacle.
I don't really have a good answer to that question, but it does bring up this reaction that I had to those YouTube for Kids videos, which it's still kind of unclear as to how much AI was present in the production of them versus how much like human intention was present. But when they were released and talked about, you know, and these were videos with like Spider-Man driving a race car with Venom, and they drive the race car into a pool, and then the pool turns red and then green and then blue. And it's kind of like this free associative, nonsensical, like children's content that was made just to generate ad revenue on YouTube. When I saw that, and when I was making video art, like kind of like that, I felt obsolete, you know, because I was like, this is so much more poetic and just like rich as a cultural product than anything that I could possibly create. And it exists in like in such plentitude, you know. There were thousands of videos that were online, and I can share a link to them later, that were then wiped. But yeah, do you have like an actual answer, either of you?
So do you want
I'm
to
going
take a
to
crack
cede
at
the
it?
floor to Josh on that.
I mean, Anthony, you asked a good question, a big question. And then I just saw Thomas in the chat just asked a hey artist Andrew Norman Wilson question. So I don't know if you want to look at that, but I mean, as far as the sort of weakening of the collective imagination. I mean, it's a great sort of maybe meta question. It leads me to think of a lot of sort of sub questions. I mean, my sort of initial kind of gut reaction, I always think of like, what sort of exists on a lot of these mainstream streaming platforms, seeks to sort of provide this kind of impression of a sort of like media totality, right? Like as if anything moving image related like exists on a couple platforms, right? And then maybe sort of amateur content on YouTube. And I think that is, dangerous as far as, a kind of weakening of a sense of possibility, because of course there's like other media, there's other ideas, there's other works of art that exist beyond, those platforms or those main kind of media nodes. And this is something, I'm thinking of just working with my students, and I teach at a liberal arts college, and I'm always very interested, when freshmen, are coming in, starting the semester, what media do they look to and where do they find it and how do they consume it? And I think a lot of sort of my work, and this sort of stems from the thoughts from this question, is sort of getting people to think kind of outside of, these sorts of mainstream kind of hubs of media generation. And maybe a generation ago would have been sort of thinking in terms of mainstream cable or, the era of the big three networks, but that there are images, there are things that are sort of beyond these sort of centralized nodes. And there just needs to be a lot of work to sort of get people to sort of look beyond and look outside. And it's not just a danger of like, the media that's just consolidated there, but it's a danger, I think, regarding a kind of narrowing of form, right? That so much of the media that gets consolidated in those platforms, it is formally very similar, very resonant one to another. And takes, I think, expanding a notion of ideas and possibilities, for action and agency that has to go kind of hand in hand with questions of craft and form and style. And so, looking beyond perhaps, the Netflix and the Disney and whatever, Discovery, Warner Media kind of cooks up, I think will be a really important part of just thinking of how media can connect to, the crucial crises of our moment.
I guess I have a question. And then I really do want to be mindful of people's time. And I'm trying to synthesize a couple of thoughts that I'm seeing or comments and observations that I'm seeing going in the chat, and I think I can pose it to you both. I guess the question is, is a kind of like, Josh, you've been working on these like you've been working on deep fakes and, creating like media literacy kind of classes or learning modules for people. And Norm, I think you think very critically about, how images circulate, obviously, like that goes without saying. But, is criticality like enough? Is a consciousness of, how these forms operate and kind of play on our senses and distort things, or that they are always already distorted, like enough at all? Like what does that really do? Sorry, that's a big question.
It's a great question. Norm, do you want to go first?
Sure. Is critical? It's difficult because I think it's different in different contexts. Like we're here on a Zoom panel with, it's like averaged around 40 to 50 participants, and being in the art world has fostered and nurtured a lot of my more radical attitudes and beliefs. But I'm also very aware that it kind of requires like an advanced graduate degree or a yacht to participate in the field for the most part. And so its reach is very limited. And I think that it uses a language or languages that are inaccessible to maybe, let's say, the people who need it most, or yeah. I'm just not quite sure like what to do right now within the art world as an artist with my criticality, because it seems like the reach is so limited. And so Impersonator is a way for me to try and like work in another setting, right? It's a unified work. It's like it stands on its own, but it's also a proof of concept for a feature film. And it's not like I have many illusions about what my political potential within, say, the film industry might be. But it is a space that I want to explore, that I'm pretty naive about, and obviously has a much broader reach, but also maybe like, or definitely tighter reins on creators. And so, yeah, I'm just like in the middle of this journey, and I'm not quite sure what to do with my criticality as an artist anymore. But I think something that Josh said earlier about in reference to Werner Herzog about new images, that's something that's always motivated me, and that's the work that I've always been drawn to, the work that makes me see things in a way that I haven't seen things before. It makes me feel things in ways that I haven't felt before, or think about things in ways that I haven't thought about things before. And so that's, with every project, that's kind of the bottom line. It's not like, how can I create a stand-in for brilliant media scholars, the work of brilliant media scholars like Josh within an art video, right? Or a sculpture. It's like, I'll let the essay do that, or I'll let journalism expose injustices, right? Or I'll let activists apply pressure in areas where pressure needs to be applied. But yeah, I'm just trying to like look at, feel, and think about things differently.
I think that's a really nice way to finish our conversation, unless you have, thank you, Norm. Josh, unless you have any other thoughts.
Well, you know what? I think it's appropriate. Let's let the artist have the last word on this. So that's great, and you're getting a lot of nice shine from the chat. So I think that's great.
Yeah. Well, I just am so thankful for you both for speaking with one another and sharing your expertise, Josh, and your deeply considered work, Norm. And thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. And we will see you all soon. I hope.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. And thank you, Selby, for moderating and let's gather.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Night. Josh.
What's up?
Here? How's it going?
It's going well, man. Hold on. Have they cut the cord on this? Or they?
Oh, maybe not. Maybe we should leave. I was like, this is a private room now, but it's probably not. I'll just talk to you later.
Okay. We'll be in touch.
Bye.